Despite advances in medical technology, circumstances still exist in which people have been alive and well to attend their own funeral. Today, I'm going to introduce to you a few people who either faked their death, woke up in the nick of time, and even one man who heard about his own funeral from a stranger. Hold on tight, subscribe to the channel, and let's take a closer look at 10 times people woke up at their own funerals. Number 10. The wonderful wiggling Walter Williams. 78-year-old Walter Williams died on February 27, 2014. Or at least, he did a dynamite impression of someone who had died. After several nurses, doctors, and the coroner failed to find signs of life, Walter was declared dead and zipped up in a body bag. He was then transported to a local funeral home for all the usual posthumous processes. Rather than waking up at his own funeral, he woke up at his own embalming. When Walter was moved to the embalmer's room, the person who uncovered him noticed that his legs were wiggling around. While it was possible for a corpse to spasm shortly after death, Walter then went on to start breathing again. He was quickly rushed to a hospital where it seemed the whole bizarre ordeal had little effect on him. As it turns out, Walter was close to the end, however, and just 2 weeks later he died. And this time, it seems to have taken. And if you think waking up seconds before being embalmed is a shock, wait till you hear the close call we have at number 1 today. Number 9. Fagilyu Muhammadyanov. Maybe one of the worst return to life stories on today's list. 49-year-old Fagilyu Muhammadyanov of Russia apparently died of a heart attack in 2011. Officials took her to a hospital where she was pronounced dead. The family was notified and she was moved to a funeral venue in Kazan, where family and friends set about praying for her. But it was then that Fagilyu suddenly awakened. It turned out she wasn't really dead at all, at least yet. She was so shocked that she had a second heart attack. Only this time, it was the last one. She was rushed back to the hospital where she pronounced dead once and for all. Number 7. Pastor Alf Lukau's traveling revival show. Pastor Lukau is a local faith healer of sorts in Santon, Gauteng, a wealthy section of South Africa. Each year he takes in millions of dollars and lives a lavish lifestyle with his wife. One day in 2019, a corpse was brought into town. The funny thing about this corpse was that it was breathing and moving. After noticing a light breath and movement from a finger, someone ran to get the pastor, who immediately gathered a crowd, raised the body from the dead, and sent him on his merry way. While it is unlikely the man was ever dead and Pastor Alf's timing was just good, this story has garnered quite a lot of attention, both in South Africa and abroad. Number 6. The old switcheroo. In October of 2012, 41-year-old Gilberto Araujo was brutally slain in a violent confrontation at his workplace, a local gas station in the town of Alagoinhas. After his body was recovered, Gilberto's family was called to the morgue to identify the body as Gilberto's. Then he was embalmed and processed, and a funeral was planned. But as the family gathered for a wake, they received a phone call from someone claiming to be Gilberto. They dismissed it as a cruel joke and tried to mourn in peace. But a short while later, someone came to the door. You guessed it, it was Gilberto. His sudden appearance sparked mass panic, with multiple people, including his mother, fainting and many others fleeing in terror. So just how did Gilberto go from being an embalmed corpse to attending his own wake? Here's what happened. Someone was murdered where Gilberto Araujo worked as a car washer. Because of some confusion about his shifts and possibly the location he worked at, it was reported that the slain worker was Gilberto. After a few days, Gilberto became aware of the situation when he learned that his funeral was coming up. He tried to phone his family but had been taken for a prankster. With no other way to convince them, he simply appeared at his own wake to set things straight. Number 5. A hit and a miss. Noella Rakundo was trapped in an abusive relationship with her husband Balenga Kalala. The two of them were living in Australia when Noella's stepmother passed away. She had played a key role in her early life, and in order to attend the funeral, Noella flew back to her hometown in Burundi. That one went off without a hitch, and no one came back to life. Following the funeral, Noella decided to take a walk, but as she stepped out of the hotel, she was kidnapped at gunpoint. Rather than execute her or demand ransom, they wound up explaining that the hit was put out by her husband. The kidnappers told her that they didn't kill women and children and eventually released her. She arrived back home in perfect time to confront her husband in the middle of her own funeral. He was later arrested and sentenced to 9 years in prison. And I'm pretty sure she filed for divorce. Number 4. Zedcom Hijinks Part 1. Meet Zong DeYang, a 66-year-old man who was starting to doubt that he had made any real impact on the people around him. Wanting to know who all would show up if he simply died tomorrow, Zong faked his own death and planned his own funeral. Seeing the number of people that showed up to Zeng's funeral wasn't just an indication of how well liked he was in this lifetime, he also considered it an indication of how he would fare in the afterlife. According to certain Chinese religious beliefs, the quality of a person's afterlife is determined by how well their grave is being maintained. So each person that attended his funeral was one more person who might find it in their heart to prevent his eternal suffering by performing routine maintenance. On the bright side, 40 people he invited did show up, and over 100 other people who heard of his death and wanted to pay tribute. Certainly, Zong must have been thrilled to see how many people cared, but it wasn't quite so simple. Zong was a bit of a glass-half-empty kind of guy, and despite the 40 people that did show up from his closer acquaintances, friends, and family, there were 20 people who didn't show up. Thankfully for Zong, the whole thing was a hoax, and he was still alive to personally haunt those who didn't show up. Unfortunately, I'd imagine a few of his family members probably weren't amused, and when he dies for real, hopefully they don't choose to sit it out. After all, how many funerals does one person need? Number 3. Zedcom Hijinks Part 2. Something like staging one's own funeral should really be exceedingly rare, but somehow it's not. The second such instance we have here today is the story of a Serbian man named Vuk Perek, who also faked his own funeral, solely to see the turnout. Unlike Zong, who waited until after his funeral to reanimate himself, Vuk watched his own service from a distance, and once he determined that the whole thing had gone on long enough and sufficient respect had been paid to him, he walked down to the crowd and thanked everyone for showing up. After the initial shock wore off, I'm sure that one or two of the attendees would have gladly helped make his prank a reality. After all, how infuriating would that be? What would you do if a loved one claimed to be dead only to reappear? Would you be mad? Relieved? Let us know in the comments. Number 2. Dropped off at the last second. Picture it. Hertfordshire, England, 1571. In the tiny village of Browing, a well-loved farmer named Matthew Wall died, and the entire village came out to pay their respects. The casket was brought to the cemetery by horse and carriage before the pallbearers unloaded it and walked it to the burial site. It was along this walk to the burial site that the locals gathered to watch the procession pass. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, one of the men dropped his casket and out came rolling Matthew. Now ordinarily, this would have been a horrifying corpse, but in 1571, they weren't doing very much in the way of preparing corpses, so Matthew had basically been pronounced dead and tossed in. Needless to say, the onlookers were shocked. So was Matthew, who had just woken up beside his own casket, and not a second too soon. In the end, Matthew became something of a local celebrity, and for years to come, the village celebrated Old Man's Day to commemorate the resurrection of Matthew Wall, who, by the way, wouldn't die again until 1595, nearly 25 years later. That one, however, was a tiny bit more permanent. Number 1. This waiter's still warm in the middle. Our number 1 story today doesn't date back hundreds of years. In fact, it takes place in 2012 when medical science was pretty good at distinguishing between alive and dead. A 28-year-old waiter named Hamdi Hafez Al-Nubi was in the middle of a shift when he suddenly had a heart attack and never recovered, being pronounced dead a short time later. Being from a devout Islamic family, his parents immediately began preparing him for a traditional burial. After the body had been ceremonially prepared, it was then sent back to the medical examiner for one final sign-off. A mere formality, really. However, when the body arrived at the medical examiner's office, he made a shocking discovery. Hamdi's body was still warm, something that was impossible if he had truly died days before. Hamdi was moved to a hospital where he quickly recovered, and his family used the date and venue of his funeral to host a celebration instead. Compared to all the people on today's list who attended their own funeral, this probably sounds like the funniest. That's all for 10 times people woke up at their own funerals. Which story was your favorite? Have you heard of similar stories? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to Trend Joint for more incredible videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.